It's easy to take for granted that we all understand how our daily measurements of time and the organization of our calendar dates all work, despite it being a conglomeration of different numbers and seemingly unequal proportions and subdivisions. We have 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 24 hours in a day, and 7 days in a week. A month is made up of 30 days, or 31. One of them only has 28, except every 4 years when it gets an extra day, because the year is actually 365.25 days long. Well, actually slightly less than that. So we only have leap years on every 100th year that's divisible by 400. So for example, 1900 wasn't a leap year, but 2000 was. Also, the calendar that we currently use is generally universal, but there are others, which means it isn't 2025 for everyone. Currently, it's 5,785 in the Hebrew calendar, about 4,722 in the Chinese calendar, 1947 in the Shaka Sambat calendar, and 1404 in the Persian calendar. But the Gregorian calendar is the most commonly used calendar in the world, and that's what we'll be looking at today. And some of the bold plans and unsuccessful proposals to reorganize the way we tell time and organize our calendar. To give a very brief overview of how our current calendar came to be, our general outline of months and their corresponding days originated in ancient Rome. However, the number of days and even months in a year could vary depending on the lunar and solar cycles for the year. When Julius Caesar came to power, he wanted a more consistent calendar in order to fix the drift days that had occurred over time with the Roman calendar, and to create a firm, repeating calendar. As some politicians occasionally added the flexible days to the calendar to draw out their time in office before their set dates of expiration came up. So, we got the Julian calendar, named for Julius Caesar, which has our familiar 365 days a year divided over 12 months, with extra days added to the ends of all of them to get 30 or 31 days, except for February. The removal of the occasional extra months of the year can still be seen in the names of September, October, November, and December, whose names mean 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th month respectively, but which have now all been shuffled down 2 places. As for our 7-day week and the names of the days, they come from Babylonian and Greco-Roman traditions, with modifications based on the languages and cultures that use them over time. And so the Julian calendar would become the most common calendar in the Western world for roughly the next 1500 years. The concept of our BC AD or Anno Domini calendar comes from Dionysius Exiguus, or Dennis the Short, a 6th century monk who came up with a dating system starting from the birth of Jesus, which he attempted to calculate using available records. Modern historians have found that he was slightly off and that Jesus was actually probably born around 5 BC, but still a pretty good estimation given the limited resources he was working with. A common way of recording chronology at the time was to date things as AUC, Anno Urbis Candide, meaning from the founding of the city, referring to the founding of Rome. For the record, our current year of 2025 would be 2778 AUC, in case you were interested in keeping up with that calendar. By the 16th century, the Catholic Church had become aware of an error with the Julian calendar that was progressively becoming more apparent. The slight difference between the previously calculated annual length of 365.25 days and the more accurate 365.2425 days, which scholars had since calculated, had added up over time. The Julian calendar had become off by about 3 days every 400 years since its inception. The Church's calculation for Easter are done in relation to the spring equinox in March, and a growing inconsistency had been noted since the medieval period. It was decided to realign the dates and prevent a future drift of calendar days. The new calendar, the Gregorian calendar, named after Pope Gregory XIII, who oversaw the reform, made an 11-day correction and came into effect on Thursday, October 4th, 1582, which was followed by Friday, October 15th, 1582. The calendar instituted the stipulation for leap years occurring on the 100th year only if they were divisible by 400 as well, which we had mentioned earlier. Many Catholic countries in Europe adopted the new Gregorian calendar right away, but it rolled out to others over the next few centuries, replacing the Julian calendar. For instance, Britain adopted it in 1752, Japan in 1873, and the last European country, Greece, doing so in 1923. The Gregorian calendar also made the key change of establishing January 1st as the date of a new calendar year, which wasn't actually standard before then. While some did celebrate it as New Year's, others celebrated September 1st or March 1st as part of a new year on the Julian calendar. In England, the new year used to start on March 25th. This made for some interesting quirks when England finally switched to the Gregorian calendar in 1752. The switch occurred on Wednesday, September 2nd, 1752, which was followed by Thursday, September 14th in the British world. Combining with New Year's Day being moved from March 25th to January 1st, this made for a larger shift in the overall calendar. As an example of the effect this had, George Washington, who was born in Virginia, then a British colony, had his birthday and year moved from February 11th, 1731 to February 22nd, 1732 because of it. We also see an example of the time lag in the 20th century, with Red October being the common name of the Communist Revolution in Russia in October 1917, when the country was still using the Julian calendar. For much of the rest of the world, it wasn't late October, but early November, so the term Red November was used. But it's the outdated Russian phrasing that's actually the more common and well remembered. The Gregorian calendar, a mix of Greek and Roman, Christian and Hebrew calculations, traditions, and modifications with input from many European languages, remains the most widely used and understood calendar today. But during the French Revolution, some reformers asked if there wasn't a better way, one that involves starting fresh, with consistent, reasoned, and well-structured means of measuring with our clocks and calendars. The French Revolution of 1789 was a watershed moment in history, and the culmination of the reason-based and scientifically informed ideas of the Enlightenment period. Before it spiraled into executions, strife, and war, the revolutionaries wanted to create a French society based in equality and reason with lasting changes to the government, social order, and class. In addition to ideas of balanced elections by the general population, the revolution left us with another major change that we still see today, the metric system. The government of the revolution wanted to break all aspects of society and its institutions away from the past, and disassociate everything from royal and religious influence or historical ties to the monarchy and the church. Scientists and mathematicians set about forming a system of measurement that came purely from scientific measurement, and whose groupings and orders of magnitude were consistent and logically organized, namely using a base 10 for increasing or decreasing in scale. The meter was originally meant to represent 1/10,000,000th of the distance from the equator to the North Pole. Though their calculations were slightly off, the unit of 1 meter that they came up with is still what we use today. Once that was decided, it was divided and multiplied exponentially by 10 to give bigger and smaller units, breaking down into centimeters, or 1/100th of a meter, those breaking down into millimeters, or 1/1000ths of a meter, etc. From a meter, you move up to the seldom used decameters for 10 meters, or hectometer for 100, up to the familiar kilometer, representing 1,000 meters. The unit of 1 centimeter was used to form a cube, the volume of which would be 1 milliliter, and the weight of it 1 gram. From here, units of smaller and larger weights and volumes were made up once again by increasing or decreasing tenfold, giving us units like liters and kilograms. Temperature was calibrated with 2 clear changes of state for water, freezing at 0 degrees and boiling at 100 degrees. The amount of energy needed to raise 1 milliliter of water by 1 degree would be a calorie. It wasn't just measurements of the physical world that the French revolutionary government looked to reform. They also wanted to create a new system for measuring the passage of time, which would be the metric calendar. To start with, a day was composed of 10 hours, with noon at the 5th hour and midnight describing the 10th. Each metric hour was composed of 100 metric minutes, and each of those minutes was made up of 100 metric seconds. A metric second was shorter than a standard second, but a metric minute was longer than a standard minute. So, in the end, the day was still the same length between the old and new systems. There were still 12 months in the new revolutionary calendar, each composed of 3 10-day weeks called decades. If you do some quick math on that, it amounts to only 360 days a year. The extra 5 days to make up a full year would be national holidays that took place at the end of the year, each named after a laudable trait or attribute. A 6th day, celebration or revolution day, was added during leap years. The 12 months were poetically named and seasonally themed. They were Vendemer, Brumaire, Frimaire, Nivos, Pluvios, Ventos, Germinal, Floreal, Prairial, Messidor, Thermidor, Fructidor. The suffix of each month also indicated what season the month was part of, which I think is an interesting touch. The British press reprinted their own mocking take on these new months, renaming them Wheezy, Sneezy, and Freezy, Slippy, Drippy, and Nippy, Showery, Flowery, and Bowery, and Happy, Croppy, and Poppy. The individual days of the week also had names in addition to their calendar placement. But the revolutionary calendar did not allow honorifics for monarchs or the church. The new revolutionary calendar was named according to everyday items, objects and tools associated with the working class. This includes such inspiring things as Cabbage Day, Ladder Day, and Goat Day. The 10 days of the week were less creatively named, however, simply being named First Day, Second Day, and so forth. Deciding the starting point of the calendar proved to be a bit tricky. The start of the revolutionary calendar was initially dated from July 14th, 1789, the storming of the Bastille, traditionally seen as the start of the French Revolution. But in January 1792, the new government decided that they were in the fourth year of the new era, with the beginning having retroactively taken place on January 1st of 1789. However, on September 21st, 1792, the First French Republic was officially declared and the calendar reset to Year 1, and that the following New Year's in January 1793 would mark the start of Year 2 of the revolutionary calendar. But this was altered once again in October of that year, when the calendar was finally set for good, this time marking September 22nd, 1792, the first full day of the new French Republic as the start of Year 1. This marked a final, firm start to the new calendar, but also added the strange feature of having the new year begin on a fairly odd date as opposed to the start of the first of the month. Clocks and watches were manufactured which kept time using the new system, many of which included both metric time and standard time to help people understand and transition to the new revolutionary time. However, most people just used them to read time with the traditional values and never bothered to learn the new way. Even for those who wanted to use the new system, they would run into difficulties trying to do business with their fellow countrymen if they didn't follow the new calendar. The same problem arose when trying to do business internationally with neighboring countries who didn't use the new calendar. Coordinating and scheduling often proved to be very difficult. Workers were also upset because the new calendar provided 1 day off every 10 days, with a half day off midweek on the 5th day, as opposed to the old calendar, which had 1 day off every 7. Additionally, while the new government wanted to disconnect itself and any of its institutions from religion, many people in France were still devout Catholics and followed the church calendar. Much to the chagrin of the new government, people kept track of when Sundays would be in the new calendar and took the day off anyway. Napoleon would come into power as first consul, then as Emperor of France, and shortly after his coronation, he abolished the calendar. And in 1805, the 14th revolutionary year, it was discontinued. You can still find metric timepieces in shops and antique stores. There wouldn't be another attempt at calendar reform as drastic as metric time proposed for quite a while, but there has been a widespread and lasting change implemented to our clocks that you're probably familiar with: daylight savings time. The concept of synchronizing the changing of our clocks to maximize summer light goes back quite a way, but it never had a formalized effort for its implication until the turn of the century, when Englishman William Willett became its strongest and most relentless advocate. In 1907, he wrote a pamphlet, The Waste of Daylight, outlining the benefits of daylight savings time, which quickly began to gain traction. The general idea is that during the summer months, when there's more daylight in a 24-hour period, the clocks are set ahead so that people can rise earlier and take advantage of having more sun earlier in the day, as well as having more sunlight to enjoy after the typical workday ends. In theory, if clocks are turned ahead to allow for an early start to the day, energy consumption, especially fuel, which at the time the idea was first being widely discussed was primarily coal, would be conserved. While it's a commonly held belief that farmers are some of the most fervent supporters of daylight savings time,
8:58. First time I've ever been early for work. Except for all those daylight savings days, lousy farmers.
the opposite is actually true, with many farmers voicing opposition to the practice of turning back the clocks. Most farm routines happen according to what time the sun indicates as opposed to what the clock says anyways. Animals will wake up and require attention at the same time, dew won't evaporate until the sun comes up, and equipment and things like produce stalls would have to be set up with less time in the morning. Port Arthur, Ontario became the first place in the world to start using daylight savings time, beginning on July 1st, 1908. The first nation to start using it as a whole was Germany, who implemented it in 1916 to help conserve energy for the war effort, much to the chagrin of British advocates who had been pushing it in their home country for several years by that point. Starting the morning an hour early meant less oil and coal used for lighting and an extra hour of gardening time for crops devoted to the war effort. The US created the Standard Time Act in 1918, and most of the Allied countries would follow suit, and by war's end or shortly after, most of Europe and North America had seasonal daylight savings time in place. The practice of daylight savings time would come in and out of use in the West over the next few decades, seeing more steady and widespread use through the Second World War, once again as a wartime measure, before being largely standardized in the 1960s. Every year, usually in the spring when the clocks move forward, which feels like the more disruptive of the two clock changes, there's always talk of abolishing the practice altogether. For example, in Canada, the Yukon stopped observing daylight savings time in 2020. The vast majority of Saskatchewan has never changed their clocks. Parts of Quebec and British Columbia don't either. Parts of the US also don't follow daylight savings time. When it's not standardized across a country one way or another, it can lead to quite a bit of confusion, especially in terms of time zones, which can vary by more than one standard hour per zone depending on the time of year. We have occasionally had to readjust as well, as the date that the clocks go forward in spring or back in the fall has changed over the years, and countries who do practice daylight savings time aren't always synchronized on the dates of these changes. What hour the clocks are changed at overnight can also vary from place to place. I would like to think, at least in North America, if we were to stop using it, it would be best to have a consensus to stop using it across the nation as a whole, or at least coordinate with the neighboring states south in each time zone if they were to cease using it. Even when locations do decide to stop changing their clocks for daylight savings time, the question always arises as to whether or not they will revert to standard time all year or have permanent daylight savings hours. Different territories have gone on either side, which also throws off the uniformity of time zones in some areas. Critics of daylight savings time have pointed to a number of negative impacts, apparently connected to changing the clocks. Some estimates have said that daylight savings time actually costs more in terms of energy and business inconveniences as opposed to saving money. This may be due to how technology has changed or energy is used as opposed to when it was first implemented. Studies have shown changes in sleep, grogginess, and poorer work performance occur when the time is reset, and that there's even an increase in heart attacks and traffic accidents tied to the change in time. However, these claims have also been countered and refuted. It's a more complex concept than people may assume. It's not just a relic from wartime austerity that stuck around longer than it should, as is sometimes suggested. There's a strong commitment on both sides of the discussion, and I'm sure it's a conversation we'll be having for some time to come. Returning to proposals to change and improve our calendar, we start in the later half of the 19th century. It was a time when universalist ideas were being widely discussed, with strong advocacy for bold ideas for uniform practices and measures, and devotees attempting to implement them. The underlying drive was to theorize and put into practice the most efficient means of organizing, categorizing, and accomplishing things on a large scale and having them applied worldwide. This included the continued spread of the metric system, the weights and measures, that is, the calendar never caught on, scientific naming conventions, and categorization. The establishment of time zones around the world, as well as proposals for a universal language, currency, and even postage that would be recognized for mail delivery throughout the world. It was during this time when the scientific community and progressive industrialists looked for consensus and uniformity that attempts to reform and perfect the calendar came back into discussion. The first new attempt came in 1849 when French philosopher Auguste Comte, who formulated the positivist school of thought, published his ideas for a new yearly calendar often referred to as the positivist calendar. It consisted of 13 months, each containing 28 days, making for an even 4 weeks per month. All months would have the same dates on the same days of the week, making for continuous symmetry throughout the year. Comte and positivism were descendants of French revolutionary thinking and reflected many of the same scientific, rational, and progressive ideals. The months were named after figures from Western religion and literature, somewhat contradicting the emphasis on modern rationality, as well as philosophers, political leaders, writers, and inventors. Months included Moses, Homer, Aristotle, Caesar, Charlemagne, Gutenberg, Shakespeare, and Descartes, among others. In this way, just like the revolutionary calendar, the positivist calendar had each day of the year named for something different, replacing the concept of a saint's day. The positivist ones weren't quite as agrarian-based as the revolutionary ones, though, and each day was named for a celebrated person in history, as well as people who were despised, with the theory generally being that it would keep the hatred for them alive at the forefront. I'm not too sure how well that would have worked. For example, the 21st of Gutenberg was named to honor James Watt, and the 14th of Bichat was named to honor Isaac Newton, but the 28th of Frederick II was named to keep hatred for Oliver Cromwell alive. Comte's calendar never proved very popular even in its time, and didn't receive much attention or consideration from governing bodies. It is somehow both very refined and orderly, while also being a little too esoteric, artistically motivated, and abstract for practical use. Positivism was popular for a time in Brazil, though, and its flag today has a positivist logo on it. However, half a century later, a similar idea that refined and improved on Comte's plan would gain a great deal of attention and success. Moses B. Cotsworth was a statistician from the Yorkshire region who worked for the railway. He had been orphaned at a young age and raised by his grandparents and great-grandparents, who were farmers. His family was kind, but they lived in poverty. Cotsworth was fascinated by timekeeping, systems of measurement, and statistics, passions that coalesced when he grew up and began working for the railway. Frustrated with the way that weeks broke up unevenly, and the number of working days and weekends differed by month, he began developing a new calendar that was consistent and even in its distribution and organization of weeks. Cotsworth's calendar also had 13 months divided into 28 days, each month perfectly divided into 4 weeks, every month and every year beginning on a Sunday and ending on a Saturday. Cotsworth's extra month would be named Sol after the solstice and would take place between June and July. This pattern accounts for 364 days in a year. The extra would take place at the end of the year after December 28th and be called Year's Day, a day of celebration that exists outside of any week or month so as not to disrupt the perfect cycle. The year then begins again on January 1st, a Sunday. During leap years, a day would be added, again not belonging to any weekday or month, between the 28th of June and the 1st of Sol. For the superstitiously inclined, this calendar had 13 Friday the 13ths every year. Cotsworth actually liked the notion. As a strict rationalist, he thought it was good for people to confront what he perceived as a nonsensical fear. In 1902, Cotsworth published his opus, The Rational Almanac, outlining his ideas for reform. It would not be hugely successful upon its initial release, but in 1907, Cotsworth moved to Canada when he was hired by the government of British Columbia to reorganize and streamline the civil service. While there, he met famed Canadian Sandford Fleming, a geographer, surveyor, and one of the key figures in worldwide designation of time zones and meridians. Fleming took a keen interest in Cotsworth's ideas and saw them as another cornerstone for organized reforms and measurements, along the lines of the metric system and globally agreed upon time zones. Bolstered by Fleming's support, Cotsworth created the International Fixed Calendar League and wrote Time to Fix the Calendar. Finding some interest in his adopted country, he looked to bring his ideas south to the States, where conventions discussing new calendar ideas were taking place. The proposal was not without critics, though. Often the most vocal came from churches and religious institutions. Seventh-day Adventists and Orthodox Jews also did not like having a blank day in the calendar, which would throw off keeping track of the Sabbath. The seventh day, marking the day of rest, would change every year. There were, of course, secular arguments too. For instance, with the new 28-day months, some days would disappear, marking holidays and events. For instance, anyone with a birthday on the 29th, 30th, or 31st of the month. Any monthly expense, such as rent or newspaper and magazine subscriptions, would be charged 13 times a year instead of 12. Cotsworth would find a friend and supporter in famed businessman George Eastman, founder and owner of the Kodak Film Company, who's credited with bringing cameras to the masses with his invention of the Brownie camera and affordable film. Eastman believed in Cotsworth's idea so much that in 1928 he switched the Kodak Company to his 13-month calendar, and together with Cotsworth wrote to more than 1,000 other American businesses, urging them to do the same. Kodak would maintain the use of the Cotsworth calendar, sometimes called the Kodak calendar, up until 1989. If you worked for Kodak during the time the calendar was used or know someone who did, I would be very interested in hearing any stories you have. But Cotsworth would soon run into competition for his 13-month calendar plan. Joseph U. Barnes was an insurance executive from Minneapolis. He was no stranger to campaigns for social reform, being a supporter of prohibition and the implementation of the metric system in the United States. In 1917, Barnes was reviewing a calendar and admired the fact that January 1st of the year was a Monday. Marveling at what he saw as a cleanly efficient way to start the year, he designed a 13-month calendar where every year and month started on a Monday. This Monday versus Sunday start is one of the key differences between his calendar and Cotsworth's. Barnes' 13-month calendar had Vern as the third month, shifting March and the rest of the months down one spot. Once again, the two out-of-day calendar days, one at the end of the year and one in the middle for leap years, would be holidays. Together with his friends, Barnes formed the Liberty Calendar Association, capitalizing on the patriotic vigor in the country at the time after its entry into the First World War. He had not actually been aware of Cotsworth's plans when he developed his own, but the two would soon find themselves at loggerheads as the various proposals for calendar form gained steam throughout the first decades of the 20th century. A powerful supporter on Capitol Hill would come to Barnes's aid. Thomas Shaw was a member of the House of Representatives who took an interest in helping his fellow Minnesotans in the Liberty Calendar Association. Shaw was blind and would carry out his congressional duties with the help of his wife, who would read his letters, write correspondences, and drive him around the city. Shaw would get around with the aid of a seeing eye dog and would eventually serve 5 terms in office. He was an avid reformer himself and a proponent of everything from the 8-hour workday, prohibition, and the National Park Service. He would introduce a bill advocating for the adoption of Barnes' 13-month calendar 3 times, eventually having it heard by a Judiciary Committee in 1922. He felt that it was the common worker who would benefit most from the change, and he once said, "We have standardized everything else except our measure of time, the very thing we use the most." Later versions of the bills he introduced would change the month of Vern to Liberty. The committee would hear testimony from experts and advocates, including Cotsworth and Shaw themselves. It concluded the same year, but the bill never went to the House floor for a vote. However, the concept would only continue to grow and gain momentum as the decade progressed. In 1923, the League of Nations held an open call for proposals for new calendars and received over 185 proposals from 38 countries. In 1928, Pennsylvania Representative and Chairman of the House Committee on Foreign Affairs, Stephen Porter, brought the issue of a new calendar to the U.S. House once again, calling for a conference on reforming the calendar as well as urging governments elsewhere to do the same. Another major proposal for a new calendar had appeared in Europe in the 1880s and had also gained widespread popularity by this time. It was first published by Camille Flammarion in 1884 and later championed by Frenchman Gaston Armelin in 1887, and this new calendar would come to bear his name. Armelin's calendar was remarkably simple in terms of alterations to the existing Gregorian calendar. It maintained the original 12 months of the calendar, each of which would have either 30 or 31 days, including February. Every 3 months formed a quarter, the pattern of which would repeat 4 times during the year. The first 2 months of each quarter would have 30 days, and the third one would have 31. Each quarter, and in fact the year, would start on a Monday and end on a Sunday. Each quarter contained 91 days. This makes for 364 days in a year. The extra day would come at the end of the year, after Saturday, December 31st, in this new calendar, and would be a new day called New Year's Day. Like other proposals, this day would exist outside of any month or week and not have a designated weekday. It would be a holiday, and the year would start back on the next day, Sunday, January 1st. Every 4 years, for leap years, another day would be added onto the end of the year, called Leap Day, of course, and take place after December 31st, but before New Year's Day. And just like that new day, it would also not be assigned to any month or weekday. The dates of the calendar are fixed, making it another type of invariable calendar. Every year set and ordered the same way, efficiently repeating. For instance, March 4th is always a Monday, October 18th is always a Thursday. Armelin's plan won a competition held by the French Astronomical Society through the magazine L'Astronomie, including a large cash prize, and would become the standard for European calendar reform plans for over a decade. In 1900, a professor of horology, Alain Grosclaude, made a slight tweak to Armelin's calendar. He was based in Geneva, and so his idea has often been simply called the Swiss plan. The calendar is almost identical to Armelin's, except that it places the leap day every 4 years in the middle of the new calendar, in between what would be June 31st and July 1st. However, in fairness, Armelin's calendar had also allowed for the possibility of placing its leap day between June and July as well, if that's what the consensus wanted it to be. Advocates noted that these 12-month reform calendars were much closer to the already existing Gregorian calendar and were easier to adopt. Their familiarity would make them more understandable and palatable for the general population to accept. The Swiss plan picked up steam, and while Cotsworth and Barnes were gaining ground in America, the European proposals found their way onto American shores. The various reform ideas would soon find themselves in direct competition with one another. In 1914, the International Congress for the Chamber of Commerce, an international body that looked to bolster uniformity in statistics, measurements, and science, announced that a meeting would be held in the fall to determine a plan for reformed calendars. The timing for that year was of course horrible, and the meeting didn't take place. But following the end of World War I 4 years later, they convened a gathering of statisticians, astronomers, mathematicians, and religious leaders to discuss the new calendar. At the same time, Joseph Barnes, his group now going by the name American Equal Month Calendar Association, was hoping for Congress to be held in America in order to spread his vision for a new calendar to an international audience. Similar plans with slight variations or notes for modifications to the existing proposals floated around scientific societies and journals throughout the time as well, but proposals like the Swiss plan and Cotsworth's calendar were among the leading and most widely discussed candidates, and they formed the examples that most other ideas were based on. And one more major player would enter the stage. Elizabeth Achilles was an heiress from New York who lived on her own accord. She had worked as a Red Cross nurse during the First World War and had never married. Coming from a comfortable background, she wanted to use her resources to further a worthy goal. While vacationing at the Adirondack Lodge upstate in Lake Placid, she listened to a lecture from Melvin Dewey regarding a few of the long-running progressive ideas he favored. While expounding on some of his usual pet interests, like the metric system, he described his love of Cotsworth's 13-month calendar, which he saw as incredibly efficient and scientific. Achilles was inspired by the idea of a more efficient calendar, but hated Cotsworth's idea, which she thought was illogical and needlessly radical. However, shortly after attending the talk, she read an article in the newspaper describing the Swiss plan idea, and she became a passionate advocate for a reformed 12-month calendar. She founded the World Calendar Association and started writing books and publishing the Journal of Calendar Reform. Her idea was largely congruent with the Swiss plan, a 12-month calendar with repeating quarters of 13 weeks composing 3 months, 2 with 30 days and 1 with 31. She would also have an extra day at the end of the year that functioned outside of the other 364, as well as a mid-year leap year every 4 years. Her New Year's Day at the end of the year would be called World's Day, and it too would be an international holiday. This was a point she really stressed in her proposal. Though the idea had been present in previous proposals, she emphasized that a worldwide holiday recognizing peace, especially in the wake of the First World War, was highly important, and she was especially drawn to the fact that it had no specific religious or national meaning and could be recognized globally as a day off. She also made a couple of small but key changes that differentiated her calendar from the likes of Armelin's or the Swiss plan. Her year, as well as each quarter, started on a Sunday and ended on a Saturday. Her ordering also had the month with 31 days at the beginning of the quarter as opposed to the end. This meant that only 5 months of the year would differ in the number of days they had, and 7 would remain the same when compared to the Gregorian calendar, making it an even easier transition from the system already in place, which could be a strong selling point. Only March 31st, May 31st, and August 31st would be dropped. For lovers of Halloween, this meant that October 31st would continue to exist. As the 1920s moved into the 30s, the field for calendar reform proponents was becoming crowded. Advocates were vying for audiences in the ears of leaders in their home countries as well as international bodies. Most of the widely discussed plans for the calendar reform fell into two groups, those based on 12-month calendars and those based on 13-month calendars. Moses Cotsworth, once the stalwart of calendar reform, was running into trouble. Competition from the similar 13-month plan created by Barnes siphoned off support in America, and in 1932, he lost his biggest advocate, George Eastman, who after several years of severe pain in his spine and associated depression, took his own life. Candidates leading the charge on all calendar variations faced trouble as the Great Depression hit and the attention of most members of governing bodies, as well as the public, turned elsewhere, and the steam built up during the heady period of reform at the turn of the century began to wane. In 1931, the League of Nations convened the Committee on Calendar Reform to hear dozens of proposals from around the world. Only 4 of 41 attending nations cast votes, 2 for each main plan, Cotsworth's and Achilles'. The rest decided against reform or were unsure what to pick. By 1937, the League of Nations had dropped any discussions of universal calendar reform. The Great Depression had put the plans on the back burner, and they further dwindled by the end of World War II. The great period of progressive reform and universal standardization came to a close by the middle of the 20th century. Moses Cotsworth would continue his pursuits and engage in conversations in all things related to math and time calculation until his death in Vancouver in 1943, aged 84. His obituary noted, "He was laughed at, he was listened to, but the man with the great idea kept steadily on his way." Elizabeth Achilles would maintain the World Calendar Association for much of her later life. By 1940, it had over 11,000 members. She would continue writing and publishing the Journal of Calendar Reform for 25 years until it folded in 1955. She passed away peacefully at her home in New York in 1973, aged 93. One modern successful alteration to the calendar that may have its roots with Elizabeth Achilles and the World Calendar Association is the moving of most US federal holidays to Mondays to make 3-day weekends, which was one of the ideas proposed to go with the world calendar, and was solidified in the US with the Uniform Holiday Act of 1968. While the discussion over the adoption of universal set calendars reached its high point and faded away by the middle of the last century, the various proposals we've looked at continue to have their fans and advocates. Over the ensuing decades, several new proposals for universal calendars have been put forward, even if it's not the hot topic that it once was. Some of the new ideas include leap week calendars, like the 454 calendar developed by a University of Toronto professor in 2004, where each quarter of the year has 3 months of 4 weeks, 5 weeks, and 4 weeks, respectively, and a week added to the end of the year every 5 or 6 years, depending on some pretty intricate math. The Hank Henry Permanent Calendar, also created in 2004, has months with familiar sets of 30 and 31 days, and also has a leap week every 5 to 6 years. Though they keep the discussion of calendar reform alive, none of the newer ideas has built up a coalition of supporters or stirred discussion among the governing bodies of the world like their predecessors did. What do you think of any of these ideas? I would love to hear your opinions. It's quite an extensive topic. I don't know if I could commit to any of the calendar reform proposals, at least not yet, but I definitely lean towards one of the 12-month ideas, especially the world calendar. I think that makes much more sense and is a lot more familiar. I don't know about having weekdays set with the calendar date. I know that consistency is one of the big selling points of these, but I also think it kind of takes away from the spontaneity of the year, things happening on different days. Uh, I don't know. I know that isn't the point, but I kind of think it adds something every year. Um, I can say at very least something I've thought about for a while is that Leap Day in our current calendar, February 29th, should be a national holiday. Every 4 years we get an extra day, and I think that's pretty special, and it would be great if we could spend that with friends or family and enjoy ourselves and have an extra day off. That's a small thing in comparison to what we've looked at, but that is something I'd definitely advocate for. It's not the most radical plan compared to some of this stuff, but it's something I believe in. So I would love to hear your opinions. Any thoughts on these things, including daylight savings time? I know that's a hot topic for a lot of people, but I'd love to hear what you have to say. Take care for now. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time. Bye.